A supermajority of the Minneapolis City Council said they want to defund the police force and come up with some new model for public safety. But what would that be? I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, there are a lot of barriers, even though there is a veto-proof supermajority of council members, 9 out of the 12 members, saying that they would support going through the budget process to basically defund the police department. The mayor is opposed to it, but they could override his veto. But it's fairly likely that the city would require a change to its charter, which would need the support of the public in some sort of public referendum. Nevertheless, I thought this would be an interesting jumping off point to discuss this because the protests around the country in the wake of the death of George Floyd, and he just being the latest in a series of what many people believe is a pattern or a systematic racial injustice and police brutality. One wonders how we might change. Like if they started from scratch today, I mean, we're going from a model right now, Bill, that's been around for hundreds of years. Is it time maybe to step back and say, if we created public safety now, would we do it differently?
Well, I guess that depends on who's doing the creating. There are two ways you could imagine, well, there's three ways you could imagine a defunded police force to the degree where defunded means non-existent, essentially. So we'll just go with that as our assumption.
And it's a repeal and replace idea, of course, because they said that they would not just get rid of it, but start something.
So for the sake of the discussion, let's just assume that Minneapolis decides not to have a police force. One choice is to have a group of neighborhood watches and militias. It seems to me that in our neighborhood, everybody pretty much takes care of each other and is watching out for each other. And you could say, okay, well, from now on, the people are going to police themselves. There will be no professional police force, and that the people in the community will be responsible for enforcing the law within their own community. That's one option. I think that would work better in some places than in others. And I think when law breaks down, as it does here in Los Angeles, that's essentially what happens. In Los Angeles, when it becomes clear that the law will not be enforced, when looters run through groups of 15, 20 police officers and are obviously been told not to arrest them, then what happens is, since there's basically lawlessness all over the city, some neighborhoods stay absolutely secure and other ones don't. And my perception is the ones that stay secure are the ones with engaged neighbors and which are highly armed. So self-policing through militias is one option. The other option is to go the way of Great Britain, which is to basically have a series of cameras everywhere. And it's important to understand that this type of so-called police system and cameras, surveillance cameras, which some people are really in favor of, they don't prevent crimes. They simply help in identifying crimes. You could probably chip everybody if you wanted to. And then, in fact, that would certainly do it.
You mean implant some sort of a microchip that could be tracked? Yeah,
exactly. Internally, where you couldn't get at it. And that would solve the problem. All you'd have to do is just take a look at here's a murder scene. A guy's chip goes out at 9:05 p.m., oh, well, look, here's another person standing within a foot and a half of him. Who's that person? Oh, okay, so we know who it is. That is a way that you could go without police. But I think ultimately the most likely case, and if anything along these lines happens, will be the third way, which will be utter anarchy. For the neighborhoods that have the highest crime rates. The ones that have the lowest crime rates will feel the absence of the police less than others.
So it's almost like you're saying, who was it? You probably know better than I do, Hume or Locke or one of those really smart guys who talked about the idea of, man in the state of nature, but he didn't describe anarchy, that basically that man can function in a state of nature. But you're suggesting that there's a division between who those people are, whether or not they can function. What contributes to that assumption that, for example, in an inner city, it would be chaos and anarchy, but maybe out in the suburbs, it would be okay?
No, you're misunderstanding this idea of Rousseau in The Noble Savage. He said that people left alone without laws would be able to form their own governments and get rid of all of these injustices. And the only problem with that theory is that he was never able to list a single example of that ever happening ever. So the group that's prone to violence are the humans, and the neighborhoods that are not prone to violence are the angels. And I mean real humans and real angels. Every human has the ability to commit violence, and every human has the same flaws built into them because they're human. We come from animals. Civilization is something that we've learned how to do. And civilization is an idea that most of us grew up in, and that all of us grew up in. And part of civilization is the respect for law and the laws enforced by the police. So if you want to take that aspect of it out, if your approach to this is not reforming the police department in terms of more rigorous training or whatever the case may be, but if your response to this is to defund the police, then you will soon discover whether Rousseau was right or not about the noble savage, about whether or not people without laws will live lawfully, or whether the crime rate will go through the ceiling. I have a personal opinion on which one's going to happen, but Scott, I'll have to tell you, there are times when it almost seems like there is no alternative but to let people saw off the limb that they're sitting on. In other words, if this idea is catching fire all around the country, and if people are actually seriously talking about voting for this, maybe the answer is to let them try it. Maybe the answer is to abolish the police force in Minneapolis and see how things go.
Well, and that would be a very federalist solution to things. Some of the complaints that people have had are they're basically saying that this kind of radical idea, if you want to call it that, has come to the fore because incremental approaches to reforming the criminal justice system or the law enforcement system in cities have, in their view, failed. In many ways, the police have lost the public trust in areas where it's most important. And it's not just, people in the inner cities. I work with colleagues who are largely suburban people, and I've had a number of conversations with my Black colleagues about the fact that, they've got to have conversations with their kids who go to good high schools that are well funded and drive nice cars. And they've got to have conversations with their kids about how, frankly, son, life is different for us, and it's because of the color of our skin, and we need to be careful. Let me teach you what to do if you come into contact with a police officer, and what you do is actually different than what your white buddy has to do. So it's not just affecting people in the urban core. And so they're basically saying, well, maybe this is the time to reimagine what we mean by policing. And to me, that just seems like a great test for federalism, no?
Let me ask you a question about something you said. This is a legitimate question. I'm not trying to, it's not a rhetorical issue or anything. But you said that Blacks that are driving nice cars, successful Blacks, economically successful Blacks, have to talk to their kids and tell them that they have to behave differently with policemen than white kids do. How would that be different?
I don't pretend to understand fully how that would be different, obviously, not being a Black man myself. But I didn't mean to suggest that the reason why they have to behave differently is because they're driving nice cars. What I'm saying is these aren't poor people in the inner cities. These are people
I understand that.
Who are relatively prosperous, mid-level, income kind of guys who, despite the fact that they don't live in the heart of downtown Detroit, for example, or Minneapolis, they still have to have this conversation that basically tells their kids the justice system is not equal and you've got to be prepared to deal with it.
Well, here's where I was going with that. It sounds to me like if you had this conversation with your kids, with Black kids who are driving nice cars and they get pulled over by the police, it sounds to me like the advice that parents would give their Black children would be, first of all, be respectful, be polite, keep your hands on the steering wheel where you can see them, and be as friendly and accommodating as you can be.
They tell them to put their hands out the window, both hands. Well, the point I'm trying to make is these are things that I do when I interact with the police all the time. And I think that you have to address both aspects of this equation if you're going to come to a solution. This is not a coin with one side.
the attitude of people towards the police is a large factor in how police treat you. I'm not saying that there's no difference between black and white. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that that police are certainly more wary of a certain type of white driver than they would be of another, based on how they behave, how their attitude is, and so on. So that aspect of it is something that nobody talks about, but has to be included in this. But nevertheless, it's easy to say things like, this doesn't work and we're going to abolish it. The hard part is saying this doesn't work and we're going to abolish it, and here's what's better.
Yeah. And
the thing that we have to remember, this looks like it's going to be my mantra for 2020, is what happens outside the frame. In other words, inside the frame, we saw George Floyd and that horrendous treatment that he received, and we saw that and the whole world saw it. But when I say what's happening outside the frame, what I'm saying is how many police arrests occur on a daily basis, and how many have occurred over the last 2-3 years, let's say. You can't say that, that all of these atrocities happened and there was no one there to film them, because everybody in the country has their own camera with them now, everybody. So when I say what's outside the frame, people assume that what I'm saying is, if they have this knee-jerk reaction to things, what they hear me saying is that this isn't a problem, and they hear me saying, it's no big deal, and maybe he deserved it, and so on. It's not what I'm saying at all. It was appalling. But what I am saying is, if you are looking at what doesn't happen in terms of these kind of things, if you understand that virtually everybody has a camera on them now, everybody's filming everybody else, the fact that what happened in Minneapolis is so relatively rare, exceedingly rare, that the reason I bring this up is not to excuse what happened to George Floyd. The reason I bring it up is this: there are no perfect systems that deal with human beings, and there never will be, ever. There will never, ever be a system where people in authority, empowered by the law to use physical violence, will not overstep those bounds on occasion, certain individuals, and apply more force than is needed. And that doesn't matter what color your skin is. It doesn't matter what time in history you live in. If you empower the kind of people who go into police work and who need to go into police work, you will, it doesn't matter when, where, what it is, what it looks like, it doesn't matter. If you empower a certain class of people over another class legally, then that power will be abused by a fraction of that police force. Will it be 50% of the police force, 80%? I don't know. But I do know that currently in urban police forces, the numbers it's a thousandth of 1% if you look at the total number of arrests.
Well, and so, to use your analogy, I think a lot of African Americans in this country especially are saying that there's a lot happening outside of the frame that I don't see. In other words, my frame is not capturing the full picture, and I can't understand what it's like to be a Black American, especially a young Black male American, and that they live a different existence than I do, in the sense that that I don't have fear of the police, for example, or I'm not concerned about them following me. I'm not concerned about them pulling me over without reason. I'm not concerned about them threatening me. But that's outside of my frame. Let me finish with this. The group also announced,
That's fair, by the way.
This is the group of city council members and community members in Minneapolis who said that they'd like to pursue defunding the police department. The group also announced its intention to engage every willing community member to ask what safety means to them, and to create, quote, a new transformative model for cultivating safety. It would seem that such a mission would go a lot deeper than merely, what does the police force look like?
Yes. And it's clear that that police forces anywhere in the world, in history, but let's just take Los Angeles to get it out of Minneapolis. It's clear that any police force is going to have some percentage of failures in terms of the kind of thing that we see, like racial injustice or over brutality or whatever. There's going to be a certain amount of failures in anything that exists in the real world. And so the more I hear these arguments, and you got to believe me on this, this is not a damn you, I'm leaving, I'm taking my football and going home. I think that it might be worthwhile to have Minneapolis abandon a police force only because they need to see what the absence of a police force looks like. All of the failures that are inherent in human nature are built into every police force because they're made up of humans. And so you look at this and you say, this is a horrible failure, this is a horrible failure, this is a horrible failure. All of the racial inequities that you talked about, which are largely real, that's all horrible failures. But what you don't see is what would happen in the absence of a police force. And if they're saying that there's a better alternative to a police force, then I would like to see one. I can't think of one, but I'd like to see one.
Yeah, I would
so
think
maybe
as a
the thing to do,
conservative, you might be curious in the least to say, okay, you mean we're getting rid of a large government bureaucracy that wields weapons against the individual, that is dominated by unions? Maybe there's another way to do this.
What I'm saying is that the nature of the police force reflects the nature of the government of the city. The reason that I'm generally in favor of police forces is because I've dealt with suburban police forces in relatively well-to-do neighborhoods, not rich neighborhoods, but relatively well-to-do neighborhoods. And so my experience with the police force has been good, and I think these guys have the toughest job in the country, and I think they get no credit for it whatsoever. And so I'm saying, okay, if I'm saying we now have nothing to measure police behavior against. There's no control experiment. That's all I was trying to say. That's what I was looking for the whole time. There's no control. We know these things happen. Okay. So let's see what happens without a police force. Let's say that they do this. Let's say that they abolish the police force in greater Minneapolis, defund it to the point where it's essentially just a ticket writing agency and an investigative agency. And let's do that. And let's see if things get better or worse in Minneapolis. And I don't think they'll get better. I really don't. But if they do get better, then that's something that should be applied to the rest of the country. What I suspect is going to happen is that things will decay in rapid order, and that the amount of crime and murder and damage and unhappiness and all of this is going to skyrocket. And if it does, and I think it will, but if it does, now you've got something to compare your police force against. Now you've got something to compare against no police force. And this is the argument that people need to make when talking about failures on the part of the police. To wrap this up, I will simply say this. There have been cases where American soldiers have committed atrocities in the battlefield because they're young men who are fighting for their lives under enormous stresses that none of us can understand. The My Lai massacre in Vietnam is a clear-cut example of this. But the difference is not that an American soldier can commit an atrocity. The difference is, how does the society tolerate that atrocity? What is the institutionalized and the response of the population? In America, that was considered shameful. Callie went to jail for a while. I don't know what happened to the rest of the guys, but my point is, unlike in the Soviet Union or unlike in Nazi Germany or unlike in communist China, they were not sent out into the countryside in order to massacre civilians. That's why it was an atrocity, and that's why it's shameful. The individual failures of the human heart are not something that we will ever be able to repair. And this is another reason why I think an alternative to a police force needs to be tried out, because I think that people suspect that if we were to all get together and police ourselves, that there would be no abuses then, that there would be no corruption then, that there would be no favoritism then, that there would be no racism then. If you were to simply say, just for the sake of the argument, that we are now going to empower every single person who's been involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. You are now empowered to arrest people. You are now empowered to use lethal force against them. You are now empowered to uphold the law. And now it's all yours. You would see a difference. But to say that you would suddenly see a world with no brutality, no racism, no preference, nothing, is, I think, impossibly naive.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're grateful to the members of BillWhittle.com who have made this program possible. The American experiment continues day by day, and we're here to talk about every iteration of it. only because these folks have actually contributed voluntarily from their own means to produce and distribute these programs. If you've not yet become a member at BillWhittle.com, well, you know where to go. And what to do is to click that big green button that says Become a Member. You'll open up access to backstage content that you can't see right now, and also have the opportunity to be one of the writers on the member-produced blog. And any member who wants to can write on the member blog. There's a vibrant discussion going on there, and I think you'll find it greatly encouraging. I think you'll find your people. So go to BillWhittle.com, click the big green button. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.